Hi everyone. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that Gemma and I are presenting on, the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today we are aiming to present an overview of some research that we would like to expand on in a more detailed article. We will take a broad look at some influential Australian ornithology publications and explore their connection to bird protection in Australia. We will look at some aspects of how the physical format of these books has evolved, alongside changing social and scientific attitudes. But first, a few words by way of introduction. In Australia, European ways of understanding the natural world were imported by colonists and a colonial government interested in capitalising on natural resources. Large collections of Australian specimens were shipped back to European centres for study and interpretation according to the prevailing scientific methods of the day. The period from colonisation until the later 19th century saw Australian species depicted and described by Europeans in publications circulated from European centres, predominantly London. Important publications include the official accounts of various voyages of so-called discovery, established serials, and various monographs dedicated to birds. The first major reference work to cover Australian birds specifically was Birds of Australia by English ornithologist John Gould, published in parts between 1840 to 1848. We will take Gould as our starting point, as his grand work doubled the number of species known to Western science and remained influential for decades after it was published. John Gould and his Birds of Australia loom large over Australian ornithology. He is significant for his influence on Australian ornithological publications, which, due to the wide coverage of his work, has been said to have rendered further similar publications unnecessary for years after it first emerged. One significant aspect of his work was that it aimed to be comprehensive. The title ran to 7 volumes and a supplement and included 600 plates. Its comprehensiveness meant it was not portable and it was a luxurious work aimed at an elite market, so would not have been affordable to the general reader. John and his wife Elizabeth were champions of lithography within natural history publishing, and this remained popular for the rest of the 19th century. The use of lithography was more efficient than previous methods of illustration, and this is significant in terms of how rapidly he published his work. In the 19th century, most discoveries or theories were announced in periodicals, but there were occasions where John Gould, having presented his findings before the relevant society, beat them to publishing a description of the new species. Fieldwork as well as museum collections were important to his research, and this prompted him to travel to Australia to see the birds in a state of nature, as he said. Gould was also a significant collector and supplier of birds. These he either hunted himself or employed others to collect on his behalf. If collecting for science was considered acceptable in Gould's day, killing birds for fashion increasingly raised alarm. The fashion for feathered hats drove up demand so much that it competed with scientific collecting. This issue arose in correspondence between Gould and the National Museum of Victoria's first director, Frederick McCoy, in an 1865 letter, with Gould complaining, the ladies have, however, so stripped us of birds for their bonnets that but few are now in the market, and these, of course, are high-priced. However, it is debatable whether Gould's motives were much purer than 19th century fashionistas. As we can see from the quote on the slide, he was clearly aware of the display value of beautiful birds and saw them as an object that he was entitled to plunder, much as he may have held them in awe. Later generations of scientists working in the field of Australian ornithology displayed a different approach. Firstly, local ornithologists became more active, and they were in a better position to conduct field work rather than relying on specimen collections. In the late 19th century, ornithologists A.J. Campbell and Alfred were especially interested in Australian bird eggs, not covered by Gould in his publications. Until the late 19th century, Australian ornithologists still mainly published in British journals. As Australian natural history serials were founded by field naturalist clubs and societies, Local ornithologists utilised these instead to communicate their observations with other scientists. The works by A.J. Campbell and Alfred North were significant in providing relevant literature that was more affordable to amateur enthusiasts. Their guides on the nests and eggs of Australian birds also reflected changes in technology. Both drew on photography to illustrate their works, which gradually supplanted lithography in natural history publications. The works produced by A.J. Campbell and Alfred North would have been less imposing to take out into the field due to their modest size. Nevertheless, these were not yet truly pocket-sized. Collecting birds and their eggs for scientific purposes was still considered acceptable. However, there was increasing concern about the damage being done to certain bird populations. The Australian Ornithological Union was founded in 1901 to foster national cooperation between ornithologists, with its principal flanks to be the study and preservation of birds, according to the first issue of their journal, The Emu. This journal subsequently became the foremost means of communication about Australian ornithology. Gemma will take up discussion of the emu shortly. However, it's worth noting that ideas around what constitutes preservation have changed over time, as has who has been entitled to collect birds and the use of birds once collected. While the Union was an important champion of bird protection in Australia, they did not necessarily present a united front. In the 20th century, Gregory Matthews proved a divisive figure in Australian ornithology. However, he produced one of the significant publications of the period. This was Birds of Australia, published between 1910 and 1927. In terms of the history of the book, he was not especially revolutionary. Rather, he harked back to an earlier tradition of fine bird books established by Gould. In a time when scientific publications were increasingly adopting photographic illustration, Matthews' Birds of Australia is known as one of the last hand-coloured lithography books to be produced. Similar to Gould, his work aimed at comprehensiveness. The 12 volumes are clearly intended as a reference rather than something to be taken into the field. Its high production values and limited edition of 225 copies would have rendered it unaffordable or unavailable to many amateur ornithologists, much as Gould's work had been before. Matthew appears to display an ambivalent attitude to bird protection. Personally, he pursued an aspirational upper-class existence in England that included the pastime of hunting. He did not collect his own bird specimens, however, relying mainly on museum collections and purchased specimens, but he was supportive of collecting for scientific purposes. It is worth bearing in mind that during this period, attitudes to bird preservation were mixed, with the merits of photography versus collecting, private collecting, collecting permits, and public education all debated in the pages of the serials of the day.
Other than the publications that Hayley mentioned already, there are a handful of Australian publications that have been influential in inspiring bird protection measures, one of those being the Emu. Commencing publication in 1901, from the outset the journal was seen as a tool to influence society and, as the editorial in the first issue states, render efficient service both to the science of ornithology and to the cause of bird protection. Periodicals, along with books and public lectures, were a key means of circulating information and inspiring action. They have remained a key driver of change. As Spandenberg and Moser note, science cannot stand apart from these political, social, and moral issues. In Volume 7 of the Emu, 2 articles by Australian ornithologist Arthur H. Mattingly are published side by side. In the first, from November 1906, Mattingly recounts a visit to the Murray River where he photographs egret and heron nests. In the second, written only a few weeks later, Mattingly returns to the same area and is horrified to discover that nearly a third of the birds have been killed by plume hunters, with the young left to starve in their nests. The second article, titled Plundered for Their Plumes, contains vivid photographs that caused a stir internationally and are widely regarded as a tipping point in changing attitudes of people towards the plumage trade, as they finally provided evidence that feathers were not merely collected, but that birds were being slaughtered to supply feathers. Through the emu, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds in the UK saw Mattingly's photographs and republished them in a booklet called The Story of the Egret in 1909. In 1911, the RSPB again produced Mattingly's photographs to protest the cruelty of wearing feathers. They appeared on posters at 100 train stations in and around London and on sandwich boards that men were employed to patrol the West End with. As a result, the story gained international attention, and from 1913, international plume markets began to close and bird protection legislation began to be introduced. From this point on, the interest of amateur ornithologists changed from bird collection to identification, and the publications of this era reflect this shift. Two of the first books that focused on identifying and observing birds rather than collecting them were the 1911 publication An Australian Bird Book by John Leach, who was an educationalist instrumental in founding the Gould League, and the 1931 publication What Bird Is That by Neville William Cayley. In a first, both books used simple language, were mass-produced and were affordable to the general public. Indeed, the popular appeal is reflected in a rather sweet inscription on the front flyleaf of our copy of Leach, reading, "With best wishes for a Merry Xmas from Auntie Flo." Also, for the first time, these books were designed to be carried out in the field, although size didn't always matter for the scientists of old, as we know anecdotally that the museum's 7-volume folio set of Goulds were actually taken out into the field. As you can see from my photo, carrying one of the 7 is quite a feat. Leach's work is also noteworthy in representing a shift from colonial to national science, encouraging Australians to celebrate the distinctiveness of its flora and fauna rather than surrendering to the colonial rhetoric that pushed the idea that this country was somehow inferior or primitive. Indeed, the naming of the emu in 1901 was also in part a pushback on this narrative. Emus, which are native to Australia, belong to a genus of birds that were once considered primitive by Western science. In 1901, the Federation of Australia was newly minted, and rising national sentiment fostered a celebration of Australian distinctiveness, which also played out in the scientific arena. Therefore, the choice of emu was a political and cultural choice as much as a biological one. Coming back to bird protection, but sticking with the emu, according to Yarwood and their co-authors, scientific journals reflect social and cultural attitudes and are good indicators of the priorities of a scientific discipline at any one time. With that in mind, I conducted some bibliometric analysis to track change through the 120 years of the emu. Full-text searching on the digitised journal allowed me to search and record occurrences of 32 words relating to bird protection and scientific collection across the 12 decades. Each decade had a different amount of output, or in other words, varying numbers of pages, and so I averaged out the results as if the output for each decade was 2,000 pages. Context or sentiment were not taken into account, but there are still some interesting and affirming results. Some terms declined steadily across the decades, such as shot, kill or killed, gun, procure and procured, specimen or specimens, and extermination. Shot, kill, gun, and procure all have dramatic drops in the 1910s, the decade that Bird Protection Act came into force in Australia. Interestingly, specimen has a spike during the same period, as does museum, which is perhaps due to an increase in the use of existing museum collections during this period as an alternative to widespread collecting. As I was working through this project, I became aware of the deeply ironic shared language between weaponry and photography. As hunting and collecting diminished from 1913 and guns were replaced with cameras, I did expect that the word shot might prevail to a greater extent than it has, as ornithologists began to aim their cameras at birds and fire off some shots of their targets. Use of the word rare also declined steadily following the 1970s. This aligns with the transformation of the emu from a partly popular publication to one with more of a professional scientific focus. Scarce is also up and down. It could be that the use of the words rare and scarce have shifted from people boasting about their finds to a more evidence-based approach, as science has become more organised with the sharing of data making monitoring easier. Interestingly, museums remain relatively constant until the 1980s, then decline rapidly. Previous analysis indicated that over the emu's history, private authorship declined while authors with institutional affiliations increased. Museum contributors increased from the 1910s, peaking in the 70s, and then decreased in the decades following. Some terms increased steadily, such as conserve, conservation, threat and threats, management, and extinction, and I believe this clearly reflects a shift in culture. Meanwhile, the occurrence of other terms have remained relatively constant, most likely due to homonyms. For example, collected and collection can relate to both collecting specimens and collecting data, and preserved and preservation, whereby specimens can be preserved in alcohol or preserved in a wildlife conservation sense. I also carried out this analysis on Gould and Matthews' Birds of Australia and the first edition of Cayley's What Bird Is That? Here I examined the context of mentions more closely, and a shift in attitude is clearly visible between the works. For example, Gould frequently mentions how he shot and killed birds, sometimes going into great detail of his desire to obtain specimens for his collections. In contrast, Cayley only uses the word shot twice in his work, both times either stating that birds had been shot before protection measures or lamenting that birds are still shot despite protection.
The most recent comprehensive addition to Australian ornithological literature is the Handbook of Australian, New Zealand and Antarctic Birds, or Hanzab. It is published by the Royal Australian Ornithological Union, now Birds Australia, and features articles on the 957 known bird species by numerous professional and amateur ornithologists. Hanzab includes English, scientific, as well as previously published Aboriginal and Maori names for species. While field guides such as Cayley's What Bird Is That? Tended to simplify illustrations of birds to aid identification by amateurs, Hanzab provides very detailed information and illustrations clearly intended for scientific use. Published 1990 to 2006, it is distinctive for its traditional approach within the context of the history of the book. At 9 volumes, it is expansive, comprehensive, and took teams of people 20 years to complete. It also takes up a lot of shelf space. These aspects are remarkably similar to Gould and Matthews' Birds of Australia titles. In spite of being published in the digital era, Hanzab was only made available digitally via BSANZ online in 2019. What of the evolution of field guides? Digital technologies are ideal for creating portable references, with an example being the state-based faunal field guides produced by Australian museums as a handy mobile app. In conclusion, we can see from bibliometric analysis of key texts that bird conservation was an increasing concern for Australian ornithologists, while collecting, even for scientific purposes, generally fell out of favour. Looking at the issue of bird preservation through ornithological publications allows us to tease out some of the nuances of this change, while providing an interesting and useful lens through which to address developments within the history of the book. Thanks very much for listening.